now is Arthur Thompson. Again, he is the CEO of the John Birch Society. You can find them at jbs.org. You can find them on Twitter at _JBS. And they've been talking for quite some time about the USMCA, about NAFTA, and the dangers behind both of these. And I'm really happy to have Mr. Thompson on to explain to the audience the dangers of these multilateral trade agreements. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Thompson.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We've had the New American point out they've had the text, the entire text. If somebody wants to read all 2,500 pages of it or whatever, it's close to that. I've got the exact number of pages, 2,325 pages. So if you want to read all that, you can find that at the New American. You can also get summaries of it, but give the audience an idea of what the fundamental problems are with this trade agreement. It's more than a trade agreement, right?
Yes, it really is. And it first of all, it places us under the United Nations completely and its covenants, and includes in there that we will adhere to the WTO, the ILO, and lost the Law of the Sea Treaty. We never have ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty, which gives the United Nations control of all our shores, our oceans, our rivers, and that sort of thing. Because it was so onerous, they couldn't get the votes in the Senate to pass it. So they've slipped it into this agreement, and it will be ratified thusly.
Yeah, it's a kind of a Trojan horse, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And it also involves sustainable development under the United Nations. It says so many times, Agenda 21, Agenda 2030, that kind of thing. The Council on Foreign Relations, of course, thinks it's the greatest thing since sliced bread.
No, that should worry everybody, if they like it.
Yeah, and the thing is that it's interesting that there's no one, absolutely no one, who criticizes its negotiator, Robert Lighthizer. I mean, everybody thinks this guy is great. Well, he's a 20-year veteran of the Council on Foreign Relations, the New World Order building organization. I think Donald Trump has just simply listened to this man and never read the full agreement. I don't think he walked into the Oval Office one day and says, well, I think I'll sit down and read this approaching 3,000-page agreement and see what's really in it.
Well, they're looking at the short-term things. And really what we're doing is we're selling out our inheritance for a bowl of porridge. Because we say, look, I'm going to... we're already seeing positive effects from the provisions of the automotive content mandates and so forth. So we want to bring auto factory workers' jobs here to the United States and have that favorable. We want to help out the dairy industry. And all that stuff is commendable, and it's great to do that. But that could always be done under a bilateral trade agreement. President Trump has always been wise enough to talk about doing bilateral trade agreements in the past, and yet this is a multilateral trade agreement, and it has big sovereignty issues. But I don't know that President Trump is looking beyond the positive things that they threw in there to get this through Congress.
I don't think so either, because in every other aspect, it goes against his America First agenda. It sets up a free trade commission, for instance, which will bypass everybody in the future. In other words, bypass Congress. Now, the Constitution says that Congress shall regulate trade between us and foreign nations, and yet this particular agreement takes that out of the hands of the Congress, and by taking it out of the hands of the Congress, takes it out of the hands of the American people.
You know, one of the things in one of the New American articles they pointed out, it talks about regulatory policy. We should be concerned about that. I mean, if you don't want Washington setting the rules of commerce and trade for every detail of our lives, then you probably don't want some unelected tribunal doing it for us either. But the thing that really stuck out to me when I looked at this was the fact that they set aside Mexico's exclusive ownership of its gasoline and natural gas resources. That's section number 8, recognition of Mexican ownership of hydrocarbons. So why is this necessary, I would ask, if it's not destroying sovereignty? And where is the section that protects our coal and oil and natural gas, or Canada's for that matter?
That's a very interesting observation, because they're setting up what they call a North American Regional Energy Commission. which is going to bring all of the United States energy, and by that I mean gas, oil, electric, atomic, everything like that, under regional control instead of American control. And that's why Mexicans opted out, because they knew this regional thing was being set up.
Yeah, and that's really one of the few things that they've got as part of their economy. So they wanted to hang on to that, and they said, all right, we'll let you hang on to it, but not the U.S. and not Canada. I mean, the very fact that you would have to assert ownership of the natural resources that are in the ground of your country, that means that everything else, all the natural resources, other natural resources of Mexico, and all the natural resources of the U.S. and Canada now fall under the jurisdiction of these people and not under our sovereignty.
That's right. And just something very fundamental, a good question to ask is it really smart to have a trade agreement of this nature with a socialist Canada and a corrupt Mexico ruled by a Marxist?
Yeah, exactly.
Doesn't make any sense. And by the way, while these things were being signed, the Mexican president was not talking about trade. Trump talked about trade. The Mexican president was talking integration. That's right. Between those two terms.
And when we come back, we got to take a quick break here. When we come back, we're talking to Arthur Thompson. He is the CEO of the John Birch Society. More than anybody else, they have understood the pattern of how the Council on Foreign Relations and these other globalist organizations are incrementally moving us to a global governance. And you better pay attention to the details of this, because the devil is in these details. And we're going to talk about the details, the many different aspects of this agreement when we come back. Stay with us. Yeah, it is a plan for global domination. We've had the UN Agenda 21. Sometime in the 21st century, they're basically going to kick us off of the land, concentrate us into a few urban areas. They got more specific about it with the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainability, because, these people are good at what they do. That should worry us quite a bit. These people are very accomplished, and if you're going to accomplish something, you always stick a specific date on it at the same time, because if you've got a goal and you don't have a date, it's just a wish, isn't it? And that's what I was always told, and that's really is true. And so they've got a date certain, 2030. And it also, worryingly enough, coincides with the fourth turning trend that has been identified by Strauss and Howe in their book of the same name. Same people who looked at a generational view of history, named the millennial group and so forth, the millennial generation. And this is all coinciding. They know, just like Strauss and Howe do, they know that about every 70 to 80 years, we have a major structural change in society, and that is happening, and they want to make sure that it's going to change in their way to lock us into the smart cities. A part of that, of course, is setting up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade Agreement, the World Trade Organization. They would create these regional areas, and then they would eventually consolidate these three regional areas into a global governance, and that's where NAFTA came in. And President Trump looked at this and said, well, these are really bad trade deals. Get me a better trade deal. Unfortunately, the trade rep that he's got, Leitzinger, is a part of this globalist organization. And although we've got some good trade changes in this in terms of automobile manufacturing and dairy and stuff like that, this is just a sugar fix. It's going to go away, and we're going to be left with all of the bones of the NAFTA sovereignty stealing agreement. So I've been talking to Arthur Thompson, CEO of the John Birch Society, about how dangerous this is. And I wanted to get into some of the details of this, Mr. Thompson, because we have the New American publication of the John Birch Society has gone into detail. You can see the entire 2,300-page agreement. It's not a free trade agreement. It is a prescription for control of every detail of our national life. I'm looking at the different topics here: financial services, telecommunications, digital trade, intellectual property, state-owned enterprises, labor, environment, regulatory practices, dispute settlement, macroeconomic policies, and exchange rates. I mean, they have they're giving themselves control over everything, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And it's difficult to discuss the details sometimes because you kind of have your head nod off into into boredom when you get involved in that sort of thing. I would suggest that if people really want to dig down into it, that they go to jbs.org and go to our action projects and go into the USMCA, and we've got the whole thing outlined ad nauseum at that site. The thing is that, like you so well put, we may be getting some fair deals right now, but that can all change because it's going to be out of our hands with this Free Trade Commission. They can change this thing without going back to Congress. They can change it any way they wish. And that's a serious problem on into the future.
That's right. If we get into these multilateral supranational organizations, then nothing is nailed down. It is a living agreement, and the people that are going to be setting this, that's the key thing for people to understand. The people that are going to be setting this is going to be some supranational organization that doesn't report to you, that you're not going to have any control over. You're not even going to understand why you're getting poor.
Yeah, and the thing is that back in 1955, a very astute gentleman, Dr. Lewis Lloyd, wrote a book called Tariffs, the Case for Protectionism, and he was always for free trade. And then he started to really examine the issue and realize that there really isn't what we would call free trade in the minds of those of us who hear those two words, that it's something quite different. In fact, Karl Marx, in a speech in Brussels in January 9th of 1848, said he was for free trade because it breaks down old nationalities. In other words, it creates a whole new social system. And Lloyd outlined in his book the 8 things that had to be accomplished to have real free trade. He said taxes must be comparable. Secondly, a single monetary system must be in use. 3, there must be uniform business laws. 4, similar business ethics must prevail. 5, there must be uniform wage rates. 6, maximum labor mobility must exist across borders. Think about that one for a second. 7, there must be freedom from the threat of war. And 8, all the above would have to be enforced by a world government. And that is really where this USMCA is going to be taking us, gradually forming a North American Union that the Mexican government has always wanted since the days of Vicente Fox. There hasn't been a single president of Mexico since Vicente Fox who hasn't called for the integration of the United States and Mexico and Canada into a single government.
Well, you know what you were saying, Mr. Thompson, was we look at what's required with this. We can see that from our own history. America was a free trade zone. Yeah. We had tariffs at the border. And if you look at Thomas Jefferson's second inaugural address, he said, we're happy that we have, reduced useless offices and so forth. And we have we've eliminated all internal taxation so that no farmer, no laborer, no mechanic knows the tax man. They funded the government off of tariffs. But within America, we had a free trade zone. But in order, as you pointed out, in order to have that happen, you've got to have a common legal system. You have to have a common government and so forth. So if you want to have global free trade, it requires a global government.
That's right. And the whole term free trade is ridiculous because it is a masterstroke, because most people think of free trade and, oh, yeah, that's a good thing. But once government gets involved with this taxes, tariffs, imports, exports, banking laws, et cetera, it's no longer free trade. It doesn't exist. There's only one form of free trade that exists in the world today. It's called smuggling.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, I think it's also interesting that when we got away from that, that was the way that America was founded. We had free trade within our borders, and we had tariffs around the perimeter. And that changed when we created the Federal Reserve. We created the income tax. The taxation then moved internal. And they started the banks who wanted to have a global governance and a global trade. They were the ones who removed the trade restrictions, and then they put taxes on us internally.
Yes, and the individual who sold that to Wilson was Edward Mendel House, that once they got the income tax involved, then they started to cut back on tariffs as the means of funding, and having the income tax as the primary means of funding the federal government.
Yes, exactly. But, just going down through this thing, I mean, the idea that you're going to have the USMCA set regulatory practices for us. We've already got the problem that we've got now in Washington is the fact that we are increasingly ruled by bureaucrats who are not elected, who are not accountable, and they're making the rules. It's kind of like what Nancy Pelosi said. She said, well, we got to pass it to find out what's in it. And she was actually telling the truth for once, because they don't do the details. They ship it over, or they create a new bureaucracy, and that new bureaucracy sets the details and then constantly changes those. And so we not only have now taxation without representation, but we have regulation without representation in Washington. But this moves it to the international level, where you're going to have now a cadre of international bureaucrats and a tribunal and so forth. They're going to be able to set regulatory practices. They're going to be able to make environmental law, which is, we know what that's going to look like. We can take a look at the UN. They're the ones who are pushing environmentalism as a global problem so that they can have a global solution, a global government, a global tax, and so forth.
Yes, and a good example of what we're facing is the European Union. The European Union imposes regulations on those countries over there to the detriment of the people and the economy. Poland, for instance, which I know a little bit about, for one aspect that the EU has done is impose a carbon tax on Polish coal, which means they can't even afford their own coal. They have to import it from Russia.
That's right. Yeah, and just look at how difficult it was for the UK to get out of Brexit. I mean, they're still not out. They said they're getting out on Friday, but we're going to talk about that and how these trade agreements metamorphosize into closer political control, and it's already a part of this agreement, just like it was the European Union. When we come back, one more segment with Arthur Thompson. Stay with us. And we're talking to Arthur Thompson. He is the CEO of the John Birch Society. You can find them at jbs.org. You can also find them on Twitter at @the_JBS. And as we're going to break, Mr. Thompson, you made the great analogy of the problems that we have seen with the European Union and how we're going to go down that same path with USMCA. The good things that are in it are just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, and we're taking a look at the structural problems of this ship, this cruise ship that we've created here. And we can already see how that's kind of played out in the European Union, as I think it was Nigel Farage who pointed out. You've got bureaucrats in Brussels who are telling British fishermen how and how much they can fish in their own territorial waters. But of course, it wasn't their territorial waters after they joined the European Union, was it?
The thing is that they sell all of these things on the idea of a good economy and that sort of thing. But, you can always recover from a loss of jobs and economy if you're free. But you can't recover your sovereignty and independence if you're tied up into these international agreements. It's really a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, and we saw how this worked with the European Union. First they had the treaty to have a common market, and then they got closer and closer economic ties, and they got a common currency. And then they were saying, well, now we have to have even more political control of what's going on here. I mean, we've had talk in the past about even changing the currency eventually under NAFTA, but we've actually had think tanks proposing the idea that we would have common security for all three countries, Canada, the U.S., and Mexico, and that we would have a common border around those three countries, and that the security would be run by Department of Homeland Security. They've gotten into all these details. I mean, we're talking about creating one common block here, aren't we?
Yes, we are. And with these new agreements that were added, courtesy of Nancy Pelosi and company, we are going to, whether we have a wall or not have a wall, we are not going to have control over our own borders under this condition once this is fully in place, because it gives control to this Free Trade Commission of how many people can cross the borders looking for work. And
she's already said that. She said, look, we just have one common community. It just happens to have a line drawn through it. And I said, as she mentioned that, I said, again, she's being honest with us. She's telling us, I don't see the difference between the U.S. and Mexico as any different than the border between Texas and Oklahoma.
Yeah, it's a serious problem. It is interesting, as you point out. They will tell you to your face what they're doing, but it is so incredulous. People can't believe what they're saying. Oh, they don't really mean that,
That's right. Yeah, that's right. It's kind of like the Epstein stuff, right? Nobody can believe this because it's just too far over the top. When we look at telecommunications, for example, I know a lot of people are concerned about not only the health effects, but also the surveillance and privacy issues of 5G. But of course, if we're going to have telecommunications mandates from a international body, a trade body, they're going to put economic development over any of our concerns about health and privacy and surveillance, aren't they, when it comes to 5G?
Yes, and not only that, but as you have experienced, as we have experienced, we're turning control of all of this over from private enterprise to government.
Yeah.
Where they're going to censor us.
Yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they've asserted through a private-public partnership total control over the internet. That's why I call it, it's not really we ought to stop calling it the military-industrial complex. Let's just call it the military surveillance complex, because that's really what it's become. And it's going to facilitate that.
And one of the things, too, that we have to, regrettably address is that the Republicans are not much better than the Democrats in all of this.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
For instance, all the talk about getting rid of NAFTA immediately segued into replacing NAFTA.
Yes.
And in none of these discussions and I can list a litany of conservative pundits that we all would find familiar to ourselves, never one of them did they mention the sovereignty aspect and the independence of the American people in the Constitution. It was all a better deal.
If you want to know about that side of it, you got to go to jbs.org. Thank you so much, Mr. Thompson. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
You bet.
Welcome back. It's absolutely amazing if we look at the USMCA, and I'm concerned about how this is slipping under the radar here, that nobody is paying any attention to it. And most of the GOP is complicit in this. This is a very dangerous thing, as you heard Arthur Thompson talking about that with the John Birch Society. You need to go to jbs.org, take a look at their expose about what is involved in this. And a lot of things will start to make sense to you about what Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats are doing at the border. And we need to rise up and oppose this. And we need to get the Republicans who are silent on this to understand that we are not going to give up our country for some temporary trinkets. I mean, one of the biggest things of the USMCA is automobile manufacturing jobs. At the same time, these people are telling us that in a couple of years they're going to shut down automobile manufacturing for the most part. I mean, they don't want to make cars. They want to make battery electric vehicles, and they don't want to make a lot of those. Their model is not to make enough of those for all of us to own our own battery electric vehicle. They're going to have a few of them, and they're going to rent them to us. And so they don't need big factories. All the car companies are now saying, well, we're not automobile manufacturers. We're going to be mobility partners with the government. So if you think that this should be supported, because look at all the new automobile factories that we've got more jobs at, because they're going to relocate them from Mexico to the United States. That is temporary at best. At best. So we're going to be talking to Roy Moore at the bottom of the hour. And folks, we have to get behind people who support the Constitution and do it without wavering. And one of the things that we have to make sure we don't do is allow all the slander and gossip that is constantly churned out of Washington and that vile swamp. I mean, look at the P dossier that we had from President Trump, right? Who did that stuff? Oh, that was, people like the Clintons and the CIA projecting what they would do, or they're kind of honeypot traps that they would run on people. They and their partners like Epstein blackmailing people. That's exactly the kind of stuff that they were doing. They wrote this piece of fiction, and we know it was fiction now. And then look at what the same people are doing with this impeachment process. They will do that to anybody that they consider to be a danger to them. And that's quite frankly why all this stuff surfaced at the last moment about Judge Roy Moore, but he has a history for decades of standing for constitutional government, for the separation of powers. And I'm not talking about just between different branches of the federal government. That would be an improvement over what we've got now. What we have right now is a tyranny of the Supreme Court and judicial supremacy. And they presume to tell every branch of the federal government and every state in the union and every individual what we can do in our personal private lives. Every detail. Nothing escapes their purview, right? And they're going to tell us everything to do. And they don't have the power to do that. And the only person that I've seen stand up to that to the point of being removed was Roy Moore. And of course, when he did that, they removed him from his position there at the Supreme Court. And then the people voted him back in. People have talked about that in terms of impeachment. What if the Democrats were able to draw this whole process out? What if they were able to find some kind of something that they could pretend under John Bolton and the Republicans basically, turn their back on President Trump and assassinate him politically? What if they were able to do that? Well, President Trump could run and get reelected again. And that's essentially the same thing that happened in Alabama. We have a monumental problem in this country, and he has been at the center of this for a long time. And I'm not talking about a 2.5-ton monument that got put at the state capitol. What we are seeing now is the radical left is removing every kind of statue and monument to our civilization. And Judge Moore knew this from the very beginning. And that's one of the reasons why he put up at first it was just a homemade wooden plaque about the Ten Commandments. And he got in trouble with the ACLU, and they sued him in court, and the judge agreed with him and told him that you can keep the plaque, but you can't have. One of the other things he did was he had a prayer with the jury as they were beginning to have deliberation. And they said, you can't have a prayer in your court. And he goes, well, you don't have the authority to say that. And they didn't. You have divided authority, divided lines of authority. And if we don't understand that the federal government doesn't have the authority to tell us everything, and you have divisions within different court systems and so forth, Judge Moore has come out in this last week. He was the only Republican candidate in the Alabama Senate race to say he would not support prosecuting people for marijuana at the federal level. He said, we got to get back to the Constitution. There's no constitutional authority for that. He's absolutely right. How many times have I talked about on this program, the 9th and 10th Amendment were the reason that we had to have the 18th and the 21st Amendment. Because we had a 9th and 10th Amendment, all the stuff there about the Commerce Clause and general welfare and so forth, that was all in the Constitution. When we had the amendment to prohibit alcohol, the 18th Amendment. But see, there was also the 9th and 10th Amendment, which says that unless you're specifically given that power, you don't have it. And so they had to pass an amendment to prohibit alcohol. And that was, everybody agreed on that. You don't go through the problem of having a constitutional amendment just because you think that it would be nice to do that. That is a difficult process. A difficult process. They wouldn't go through that process unless it was absolutely required. So where's the constitutional amendment to prohibit marijuana? He is absolutely right, and all of these other candidates in Alabama are wrong, these other Republicans. And of course, Doug Jones would say the same thing. Because on that issue, they're authoritarian on every issue, the Democrats are. On that issue, the Republicans are absolutely wrong. We do have to get back to the Constitution. Let me play a real quick clip here about Judge Roy Moore getting into the second Senate run. Let's play video clip number 4.
Tainted with allegations of sexual misconduct. Moore said he lost because of a disinformation campaign and the establishment's lack of support and funding, not because of the allegations.
My opposition to the establishment has caused a lot of problems for me and for the people of Alabama. I think the people of Alabama deserve to choose who they want as their senator, and I'm giving them a chance.
Okay, but they did choose last time around.
With pressure from Washington, they dissuaded people from going to the poll.
Since the loss, Republicans have grappled to take back that Senate seat.
Do you think if you got the Republican nomination, there would be a risk to losing that seat?
No. I think if I got the Republican nomination, it'd be assured.
Moore said if elected, he would help bring moral values to Washington.
And sometimes we don't want to recognize God in society, and I think that's wrong because it's a requirement in our country to recognize God upon whom our principles are founded in the Declaration of Independence.
That's right. It is a monumental struggle because we have to understand, as the left does, that the foundations of our culture mean something. That's why they are so intent on tearing it down. Like I said about the constitutional amendment to prohibit alcohol. They don't go through these exercises because it's just something that, oh, let's just do that. No. They have a plan. And he understood the importance of the basis of our law. He understood the importance of our divided powers. Unlike anybody else that we have at the current time, I think he really does understand that, and that's why they dumped that slander at the very last minute. You know, I don't support John McCain, never have, but they use that same kind of dirty trick against him in South Carolina at the last minute, making slanderous allegations that they drop at the last minute. You don't have time to fully look at that, and that's exactly what happened. We're going to have him at the bottom of the hour. We've got more news coming up in the next segment. Stay with us. Folks, I want to tell you about the products that we have at InfoWarsStore.com. We've got some great specials on Prostagard and Ultimate Fish Oil. They're selling out very quickly, 35% off of both of those. But as we look at the international news and the panic, you know, are we being told the truth from China? Most people don't believe that. Most people believe that they're either hyping this up or it's much worse than they're telling us. We don't have any way to know. We do know that we don't really trust them. And I don't trust Bill Gates and our government and the CDC either. And so one of the things that I'm most worried about is whether it's real or imagined, that they will create a scenario. And they've war gamed this going back to 2003. They had Dark Winter, and they war game it on an annual basis. They just had one 3 months ago. But I played for you yesterday, 2018. It's an annual process where they go through and they bring in people with the government, and they run through a scenario. They have fake news broadcasts that are updates, and then they war game it so these people react to those news broadcasts and so forth. The one I was playing for you, after the news broadcast, they had a guy saying, well, you know, this began as a bioterrorist event in Washington, and it's hit people in the White House. It's hit people in Congress. It's hit people in the Supreme Court. And then we had the stock markets meltdown. And we've already seen the stock markets reacting to this globally. But the big concern that I have is what I see going on with the militarization and the quarantine that is happening in China. I don't want to see that happen. If that comes here to the U.S., I don't want to be corralled into some kind of a quarantine, and I don't want to have some kind of experimental vaccine forced on me. For your real health, you want to make sure that your immune system is boosted. And we've got Winter Sun, vitamin D. That's one of the best things you can do. Vitamin D. Winter Sun is 40% off now at InfoWarsStore.com. And if you want to make sure that they don't corral you into some kind of a FEMA camp, just make sure that you've got storable food. And you're going to, if it doesn't happen, nothing happens now, eventually you're going to have some kind of a storm. You're going to have some kind of a panic about the food supply system. I do believe that this is eventually going to happen here in the United States. It may not be this time. It may be another time. But I think it's eventually going to happen. And so make sure that you've got storable food right now. We get our stuff private labeled from My Patriot Supply. And that is our storable food that you'll find at InfoWarsStore.com. They've told us that they are running the factory overtime, but they're going to probably be out within 7 to 10 days. So if you want to get this stuff that has a storage shelf life of 25 years, made in America, non-GMO, the best packaging you're going to find anywhere. You can even reseal it after you open it. But if you don't open it to start with, it'll last up to 25 years. InfoWars Select Storable Food you'll find at InfoWarsStore.com. And that'll make sure that you can wait out this storm and any other storm that comes, whether it is a weather storm or some kind of a political or bioweapons storm or just a pandemic. Make sure that you have independence from those kind of circumstances. You know, everybody is talking about Kobe Bryant. I didn't talk about him at first because I'm just not. I think Harrison Smith said it best, and I retweeted what he had to say yesterday. He said, I'm not really into sports. I'm not into celebrity worship. Look, I feel sorry for somebody's family, but, you know, I'm not going to be all over Kobe Bryant. But then he included in that, he said, I'm starting to, you know, get drawn into this because of his comments. When he was talking about why he flew helicopters, you could see at the base of this that Kobe Bryant was really a strong family man. That was the basis for why he took a helicopter, because the traffic, and we talk about this all the time, the fact that you've got urban planners who absolutely refuse to add more capacity. They can't make the roads any wider, but like the buildings, they could make the roads higher. And everybody, as I've pointed out, through everybody's projections of what the cities of the future would look like would be multi-tiered. But they're not going to do that, because their objective as urban planners is to keep you locked up in the cities. They hate the suburbs. They hate cars. People like the CEO of Lyft said the car is the most evil thing we've ever invented, and the cities are the best thing. Well, that's not true. Nobody agrees with that. That's why as soon as we got means to be able to commute, we would do that. But his commute was long enough because the horrific conditions of L.A., where they continue to bring people in and continue to build buildings, but they won't build the roads. He got a helicopter because he could afford to do that, because he wanted to spend time with his kids. And that's what he was doing when the helicopter crashed. Burgess Owens, an NFL veteran, and he's had things to say before in testimony. Burgess Owens is very articulate, very wise about what's going on in this country. By the way, he's running for Congress as well. But he said about Kobe Bryant, said he was a dedicated husband, a loving father. We have a good example of somebody who maxed out. He did a great job with his life, and we're going to miss him. That's right. I think he was a good example of that. And yet we see the Washington Post and CNN reporters immediately jumping in with Kobe was a racist tweets. Just hours after he was one of 9 people, including his 13-year-old daughter, killed in an L.A. helicopter crash. You have a reporter for the Washington Post, the Washington Compost, tweeting out a 2016 Daily Beast story about a 2003 rape allegation against Kobe Bryant. Immediately criticized by countless Twitter users for her crass and thoughtless decision, as Breitbart puts it. Not only is the allegation 17 years old, but his accuser chose money over testifying. And then you had the CNN reporter jump in on this. That is exactly what we see with fake news. And it is why they are sinking in the public's estimation. When we come back, we're going to be talking to Roy Moore. He is running again after they use these same types of tactics at the last minute to make sure that he lost to Doug Jones, a guy that does not share Alabama's values. This Democrat senator that is currently there is listed as the most vulnerable senator in up for re-election in this next election cycle. Even with all the last-minute dirt that was dumped, he still only won by just over 1%, 1.7% in that vote. And he looks like, as many of the analysts have said, his choice that he has here, does he want to get run over by a car or by a truck? That's really the kind of choice that he's looking at. Again, he does not share the values of Alabama. He shares the values of the Human Rights Campaign, the people who have pushed the Equality Act, which will eliminate all religious freedom. It's already been passed by the Democrats in the House. It essentially eliminates the free exercise of religion if they can pretend that what you are doing flies in the face of what a transgender individual wants to do. That's something we have to be very concerned about. And we have to be concerned about the Constitution. And so we're going to be talking to Roy Moore when we come back about both the impeachment process, the separation of powers, and the Senate race in Alabama. We'll be right back. Stay with us. And joining us now is Judge Roy Moore. He is somebody who has been harassed by the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center. He's been sued by them, but he's never been intimidated. He's also been opposed by Karl Rove and George W. Bush and the political establishment of the GOP, including people like Mitch McConnell. As President Trump said, look, I have nothing against Roy Moore. He goes, unlike many other Republican leaders, I wanted him to win. And I think that he can win. But, folks, we can never win if we don't stand up for our principles. And I don't know anybody who has been more firm on his principles and the foundation of our country and the separation of powers than Roy Moore. He is willing to go the entire distance. If they remove him, he runs again and gets reelected. And they've removed him a couple of times, and now he is running for Senate again. And I want to welcome Judge Roy Moore. Again, you can find him at roymoore.org, and you can find him on Twitter at RealJudgeMoore. So joining us now is Judge Roy Moore. Thank you for joining us, Judge.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you for the introduction. Appreciate it.
Well, I really I followed you for years, and when you were told by individuals that you had to let the federal government define marriage, you refused, and they removed you. And yet, this last weekend, you were the only candidate at the Republican Forum who said, when asked about marijuana legalization, said, we've got to get back to the Constitution. You and I don't think I know I'm not a marijuana user. I don't think you're a marijuana user, but you understand what the Constitution is, and you understand that we needed to have a constitutional amendment to prohibit alcohol, right?
Right. I mean, no, all these things that they're pushing through the federal government, most of the powers are not delineated in the Constitution, and the 10th Amendment is very plain that the power is not delegated to the United States with the Constitution or prohibited by its states or reserved
right.
states respectively or to the people. And a lot of people don't understand that last four words, or to the people. And in other words, there are some powers that neither the federal government nor the state government have, and that is contained in the First Amendment. And that's what we're losing. You mentioned it earlier, I think, about religious freedom, and that's what I'm talking about.
Yes, that's right. We know that Doug Jones, who squeaked in at the last minute in this last case, he's now been endorsed by the Human Rights Campaign. And these are people who are behind the Equality Act. If that is passed, and of course the Democrats in the House with a majority have already passed the Equality Act. If they pass that, that is going to destroy any free exercise of religion that exists under the First Amendment. They will use that to destroy that, won't they? Right.
And I think that my concern is not the Democrats. I know where they stand. I mean, it's very plain, and they follow just like the Republicans follow the leadership. But my problem is with the Republicans that don't understand how dangerous this thing is. And I think most people don't understand. And I think they don't understand, David, because they don't realize what our forefathers knew for a fact, that religious freedom comes from God. And
that's right.
It can't be taken away by government. And that's why we have the First Amendment religion clauses. And, quite frankly, the United States Supreme Court and all the federal district courts are using that First Amendment today to take away the right to acknowledge God by saying, well, that's a particular religion. Well, that wasn't the way religion was defined. Religion was defined as the duties you owe to the Creator and the manner of discharging those duties, and was contained under the first four tables of the law by the 1828 dictionary. Now, I'm going a little deep here, fast, but religion isn't just anything you believe. If it were, it would be like footnote, I think it was 13 in the case of versus Watkins out of Maryland, where the Supreme Court said, there could be other religions like secular humanism. Well, secular humanism is belief in no God and that human beings are their God. And that's basically what they're establishing in violation of the First Amendment of the Constitution.
It kind of reminds me, the path that we've gone down kind of reminds me of what they've done with the Commerce Clause. The Commerce Clause was there to make sure that we had a free trade within the different states and everything. And they had the free exercise of religion not because they wanted to suppress religion. You know, now the Commerce Clause is being used to manage and to suppress commerce. You know, they turn everything upside down. They're doing the same thing with the free exercise, with the, you know, not establishing a religion and so forth. But we did have established religions that continued on into the 1840s. They had in Connecticut, I think it was Connecticut, but it was Massachusetts was the last one to get rid of it. They had an official state established religion, and the First Amendment didn't even affect that. And going into the 20th century, all the way up into the 1960s, we had requirements that you had to be a Christian or you know, a Judeo-Christian or whatever in various states, and that was not removed until the 1960s in state constitutions.
And what you have to, I think, explain to people first is that government and the Constitution doesn't give you this right. It's God. And
that's right.
I think
that goes back to the Declaration of Independence. That's the principles on which we're founded. If the government gives you all these things, then the government itself becomes God.
That's right. And one of the quotes that I often repeat is Jefferson, when he said, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we remove their only firm basis, the conviction in the minds of the people that those liberties are a gift of God, that they're not to be violated but with his wrath? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, and his justice cannot sleep forever." And they said that some 80 years, I guess, before the Civil War, and his justice, certainly, we went through a terrible war because we had forgotten where our rights come from. Well, we're forgetting it altogether today. And it's a very dangerous time in which we live, I think.
You talked about the difference between the Republican and Democrat Party. We look at the Democrats, and they're all competing as to who can give away the most money. We had Elizabeth Warren saying, look, I don't even have to go to Congress. I can just give you up to $50,000 to forgive your student loan. And they've all got their own programs, and they, you know, we've had one of the candidates who's no longer around saying that if she became president, she would give Congress 100 days to get rid of guns, and if they didn't do it, she'd do it by executive order. So they don't think that they have any restrictions on them whatsoever. The Republicans, on the other hand, Judge Moore, it seems to me like they believe that the government can do anything if the Supreme Court demands it, and that there is nothing that they can do if the Supreme Court doesn't permit it.
Right, and basically they just follow it. I've often explained it by saying that if somebody's trying to push you over a cliff, like Obama, that's pretty wrong and terrible. But if somebody's just nudging you that way slowly, you're less apt to think you're going to fall, but you'll fall eventually anyway. And that's the way we are with Republicans and Democrats. And I think it's on a scale you'd see the Democrats going to the far left, and the Republicans just following them to keep the vote of those people that realize how far the other side's going, but they're still going that way as well. And that's what bothers me. It bothers me because politicians, I'm running right now the Senate, and the talks I make, I have to blister so many politicians, state and federal, because their one aim is to get there. And then once they get there, their aim is to stay there. It's how they stay there. Well, they'll preach principles. They'll talk about term limits. They'll talk about stopping indebtedness and reducing the indebtedness we have. And what do when they get there? They spend more money because that's what they think people want, and that's how they get elected. And they don't stand for principle.
And that's what empowers them, because they can essentially bribe state officials by spending the money in their district. And so people are being bribed into giving up their freedoms. I talked about marijuana first because so many people are familiar with your stance on marriage. And but I've had so many people, when that came down from the Supreme Court, I had people who agreed that there ought to be gay marriage, people who opposed gay marriage. But the people that I talked to, because that's the kind of people I talk to, they said, wait a minute, we want to have a constitution. And it doesn't really matter what I think or what the judges think. We have a system of law here, and they don't have the authority to do that, because if they take the authority to do that, they can prohibit your own stem cells as medical treatment. They can prohibit vaping if they want to, because they become totalitarians. We're going to talk to Judge Roy Moore on the other side of the break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. We're talking to Judge Roy Moore. He is running for U.S. Senate. And, of course, so is former Senator Jeff Sessions, former Attorney General for President Trump. and several other individuals who were just talking about the differences between Judge Moore and the other Republicans. And we'll talk more about that. But before we get to that, Judge, let's talk a little bit about impeachment and what is happening right now. Give us your views of the impeachment trial and the situation that's going on right now.
I think the best explanation of what's going on right now is the same thing that went on in 1858 when it was a radical Republican trying to move basically a Southern Democrat by the name of Andrew Johnson. And they tried to remove Andrew Johnson because they didn't like his opposition to Congress, because he had said that he was against some of their things. He had vetoed, for example, the Reconstruction Act, and they passed it over his veto. He vetoed the tenure bill, and they passed it over his veto. And so he had basically a group of radical Republicans that were trying to remove him. He objected to things like the division of the southern states into districts commanded by a general over which he had no authority. And it was just basically they didn't like him, didn't like his policies.
Political and policy difference that they had with him.
That's right, and it's the same thing going on here. They're not going by the high crimes and misdemeanors provision of Article 2, Section 4. It's clear that he's not committed treason, high crimes and misdemeanors. And, I wonder, the whole thing, of course, I'm getting into the facts, not just why impeachment's wrong, but it's wrong in this case. But, obviously the Democrats don't want to really understand what he did and why he did it. And clearly a son of a president or vice president sitting on a board, gas board, at a time Ukraine was in turmoil, basically, and he was being paid huge amounts of money. That's under the jurisdiction of the president under his foreign relations. And he's trying to find out what the heck was going on. I understand it's gone on in China, it's gone on in South America, and basically he has every right to foreign relations is within his power. He imports ambassadors under the ambassador clause. He signs treaties when ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. But basically, there's no high crimes and misdemeanors, no treason, no bribery. So should be no impeachment. And they want to get to the facts. I think they can skip the facts when there's no, just like a court, when there's no law violated, then you don't need the facts. If there's no law that regulates it, the Constitution says regulates the president so he can be impeached.
Well, of course, they looked the other way when Obama withheld money and threatened to withhold money because he didn't like the domestic policies or corruption in other countries. He did it with Ukraine. And in a case of a couple of African nations, he said, well, if you're going to pass and sign a bill that is going to make a crime of homosexuality in another African nation, they were going to oppose gay marriage there. They were going to pass a bill there. He says, if you do either of those two things, I'm going to cut off the source of money to you. And they had absolutely no problem with that. That was foreign policy, and he was making that contingent on them doing certain things. And, of course, that was at the time that Obama was pushing for gay marriage, so you could say that that was politically motivated, tying the funds to those particular issues. But that is the double standard that we have. But I also even wonder about why we should be giving foreign aid to a corrupt government anyway. I mean, the default position should be that we're not giving foreign aid to these people, right?
Well, when the indebtedness is being raised 1-point-something trillion a year now. And we're over 23 trillion. I mean, it's going up so fast that people think the difference between 20 and 21 is not much. Well, it's a lot. And, this is going to affect our future, our grandchildren. I think Washington said throwing ungenerously the burden on our grandchildren and children that we ourselves ought to bear. And that's basically what we're doing. There is no restraint on spending money. $4.5 billion was spent at a time when they were talking about indebtedness, and they spent that on the border, and a very, very small percentage went to border security, and the rest of it was welfare for those that were coming in illegally. thing is illegal immigration. Letting people come in without the obedience to the law is just illegal. And
yeah. And the Democrats even say that in their debates. They say, we've got to stop making this illegal. So therefore, you're saying that it is illegal. But you said something about immigration that in terms of talking about how you're different from the other Republicans, you said something about immigration when they were calling them dreamers. You said there is no such thing as a dreamer. Why is that, Judge Moore?
DACA is deferred action on childhood arrival. Now that right there tells you what went on with Janet Napolitano and Department of Homeland Security. Deferred action. The executive branch under which Homeland Security falls is supposed to enforce a law. Well, she didn't enforce a law. And the deferred action. And it resulted in 20, 30 years later, we're suffering the problem of that when she didn't enforce the law. And it gets back to, the job of the president is to enforce the law. And border security is vital. And I still think we've got too many coming across the border. And we need to build a wall. And I originally I thought maybe put the armed forces down there. I don't think this is a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act to prevent people from coming across your border. If the Chinese were coming across the western border, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think that should have been done at the very beginning, because once the people get in, then they get into the legal system and they start playing these types of games. One of the things that you said was there's no such thing as a dreamer, right? Because they never passed the DREAM Act. They've had that come up multiple times. But I think it shows a difference between you and the other Republicans that you would point that out, and that you would point out the fact that we don't need to wait for the okay of the Supreme Court, do we? To get rid of DACA. I mean, that was the executive order of the previous executive branch, the Homeland Security. Why can't President Trump just get rid of that? Does he have to wait for the Supreme Court to give him permission?
Certainly not. The problem you're bringing out is very clear. I was former Chief Justice, former Circuit Judge, twice Chief Justice. But I'm telling you, judges can't make law. And when we have elevated judges to a position, if they make law, then the whole structure of the Constitution falls, because we've got one branch that's superior to all other branches. The United States Supreme Court in Obergefell versus Hodges, it was clearly wrong. 4 justices said so. But
yes.
5 justices, Kennedy being the leader, passed this, which declared marriage could be anything, basically. I mean, you say just between 2 men or 2 women. No, they basically have opened the door to what is marriage. Well, marriage was not within the federal government. But in 2013, the United States Supreme Court said that and struck down DOMA, which was passed by the Congress. They said the legislature didn't have authority over it because it was a thing left to the state. Then they turned around in 2015 and passed the Obergefell. And that's the problem. They did something which they said they didn't have a right to do.
And when I hear people say Roe v. Wade is the law of the land, I cringe, because you said, and I agree with you, that judges don't write law. I mean, they don't write law. And we've got an Indiana state representative who's now said we are going to protect human life at the point of conception. And any federal ruling or laws to the contrary are going to be null and void in Indiana. Isn't that a rightful remedy to this kind of overstepping of the Supreme Court, that we would nullify it?
That's states' rights, and I think they have a right to do that. Yes, I do. The Supreme Court, when they redefined life, you have to understand it's a redefinition of words. Just like in Dred Scott, they redefined words.
Yeah.
When Curtis and Dred Scott said, when a strict interpretation of the Constitution, according to fixed rules that govern the interpretation of laws, i.e. definition, is abandoned, and the theoretical opinions of individuals are allowed to control its meaning, we have no longer a Constitution. We're under a government of individual men.
And that's exactly what it is. We're out of time. I wish we had more time. Judge Roy Moore, you can find him at roymore.org. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you.